Welcome. Welcome to the Preservation Association of Lincoln, our online webinar. And my name is Eileen Burke, and I'm the president of the Preservation Association of Lincoln. This is PAL's first webinar, online webinar, and I'd like to thank board members Ryan Reed, Jeff Erb, and Kelly Bacon for organizing it. Our speaker today is Stephanie Rouse. Stephanie is an urban planner and architectural historian with 7 years of experience working both within and for municipalities. She began her career as a historic preservation planning intern for Ed Zimmer at the Lincoln Lancaster Planning Department, where she authored her first National Register nomination, which is the Rose Kirkwood brothel. Since then, she has worked on a variety of preservation and planning projects, including most recently, a historic reconnaissance survey of Garfield, Howard, Fillmore, and Furnace counties, and the North Platte Commercial Historic District. In her spare time, Stephanie writes about preservation and sustainability on her blog, The Planning Lady. If you have any questions, please add them to the chat and Stephanie will answer them after the program. Well, Stephanie, I'll let you get started. Thank you for doing this for us.
Yeah, thank you, Eileen, and thanks to everyone who worked to put this presentation together today and everyone who's been able to join. I'm really excited to talk about kind of preservation and sustainability and how the two can go hand in hand and how preservation can contribute to a more sustainable environment. So looking at what this talk today will cover, we'll start with understanding what sustainability is and climate change and how there's different benefits of preservation that are inherently sustainable and sustainable features, talk about some green technology that can be implemented sympathetically into historic buildings, and then how we overall can incorporate sustainability and preservation. So borrowing this graphic from Tom Mays' book, Why Old Places Matter. If you haven't read it, I suggest heading over to the library and getting a copy. It's a really great book. It covers a wide range of aspects of reasons that old places matter. And I think that we are strongest as preservationists when we talk about preserving places because they're, beautiful pieces of architecture. They hold a lot of history. They have great stories. And then more recently, our field has been getting into kind of the economic side of it and making the case for preservation as an economic driver. But to people that are kind of outside or maybe on the fringe of preservation that go to some old house tours or know somewhat about it, it's always been preservation as something that's nice to do, but more recently I think it's becoming something that we really need to do because of sustainability. So diving into what sustainability is, it's meeting our own needs today without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their needs. And there's 3 aspects to this. So there's the economic side, the environmental side, and then the social side. And today we'll talk mostly about the environmental side of sustainability. And kind of an example of this definition is we recycle or try and reduce the amount of waste that we produce because we don't want our kids or our grandkids stuck with this mountain of trash and nowhere to put it as our landfills start to fill up. So that's kind of a way to think about sustainability. Looking at how preservation fits into this, so we preserve history and stories. We have our tax credit programs. If anyone's ever heard the phrase that preservation is the ultimate recycling program, we're recycling buildings. So those are all ways that preservation fits into this concept of sustainability. But we're just one part of a larger system of sustainable management of the built environment. But we have all sorts of goals that overlap with sustainable development because we see quality of life, equitable development, resource conservation, and management of development. And I think that as a field, we need to tie into some of these larger goals within that system in order to remain effective and maintainable long term. So diving in, kind of making the case for why sustainability is something that we should care about. This came from NOAA's website. Earth's warming is continuing. We've saw the second hottest year in the 140 years that NOAA's been tracking it. Last year, which was just behind 2016. So the chart here shows the average baseline. 0 there is the baseline temperature, and since about the 1970s, we've been steadily pushing the average temperature up above that 20th century average, which takes a massive amount of heat energy to actually raise the Earth's average yearly surface temperature, even just a small amount. So the 2-degree increase that we've seen since the pre-industrial era, between 1880 and 1900, it may seem small, but it actually has a pretty significant impact on driving temperature extremes that ultimately impact flooding, drought, sea level rise, habitat destruction, a number of things that we're seeing on a global scale. What that means for us here in Lincoln, Lincoln or Omaha, depending on where you're joining from, but the University of Maryland Center for Environmental Science, they did a study of over 500 cities trying to project what future climates would be like if we continue on the current trend of emissions that's driving up the average temperature. And in Lincoln, Omaha, if the trend continues by 2080, it's going to feel more like we're living in Ponca City, Oklahoma. And that means more or warmer winters and wetter weather overall. And it's from an economic standpoint, these disasters are having an immense impact. In 2019 alone, these are all the natural disasters that cost over $1 billion. Here in the Midwest, we're all very familiar with the flooding that occurred in March of 2019 and the devastating impacts that it had, which moved downriver and impacted a number of different states below us. There was fires in California and Alaska, a number of different tropical storms and severe weather as well that cost a lot of money over the year. So some ways that historic preservation is naturally sustainable is it reduces resource and material consumption, reduces emissions, it limits waste in the landfills, reduces energy consumption, and then just increases environmental, cultural, and economic benefits. So looking at that first bullet point, the resource and material consumption, about half of all of our raw materials are used for buildings. And it's estimated that within the next 12 years, the built environment will have destroyed or disturbed the natural habitat on more than 70% of the Earth's surface. The built environment is more than just buildings and places, but it's a complex system of relationships that involve the design, planning, construction, and then the processes associated with their creation. And material extraction is just one part of that. Looking at emissions, buildings account for about 40% of all CO2 emissions, and the construction side of the buildings account for 20 to 50% of the building's whole life emissions. So you can see in the image on the left there, all of the colored parts of the ring, that is demolishing an old building, extracting materials, moving it to site, and then constructing the new building. So it's an immense amount of carbon just going towards putting up a new building. And it's estimated that it takes between, if you were to build a brand new energy efficient building meeting LEED standards, that it can take anywhere between 10 and 80 years for that new building to catch up to the energy that was wasted taking down the old building. Which leads to landfill waste. In 2017, 569 million tons of construction and demolition debris were generated. 32% came from buildings, and then 90% of that was demolition. looking at what kind of materials are going into the landfill. A lot of it's concrete, which is generated mostly from road construction projects, but 25% of that still is coming from building demolition. And then the remainder of this pie chart here is almost all coming from building demolition. So it's a significant amount of material that's going into the landfill. And as you can see here in this chart, the three materials that are circled come almost entirely from building demolition. Most of it, again, is going into landfill. Some of it, though, is finding a second life or a new use, whether it being used for fuel or composted or put into more aggregate. But we could be doing reducing a significant amount of waste by keeping more buildings out of the landfill. And then talking about energy consumption, I kind of touched on this a little bit earlier with the energy that's lost when demolishing a building. So there's this idea of embodied energy, which is essentially the energy that's used to extract the materials, and then the energy combined with the energy used to assemble those materials, which is then stored in that building. The building on the right is about a 50,000 square foot building, to give you a reference point, and about 80 billion BTUs of energy are embodied in this building alone. And if you convert that to fuel, it's about 640,000 gallons. And the average person only uses about 656 gallons of gas annually. So that's quite a bit of energy that would come down if a building this size were demolished. In addition to losing all the embodied energy, there's also additional fuel that's going to be needed to demolish and rebuild the new building. Looking at energy consumption, the Department of Energy found that buildings constructed before 1920 are actually more energy efficient. They use less energy than buildings from any other decade up through 2000. And this is because of their inherently sustainable features that were in place before modern conveniences like air conditioning became widely available in the 50s. So diving into inherently sustainable features, these are characteristics of a building or site that, because of their design, the materials, or just the natural systems, embody principles of sustainability. These include things like eaves and cupolas, which control heat naturally. Architectural styles like you see in the Kennard House here with the Italianate or Greek Revival often used cupolas. While they're an aesthetic piece of or component of a building, they also were intended to vent the building, and sometimes they provided access to natural daylight within the building. Projecting eaves and roof overhangs were character-defining features of craftsman-style buildings, but also helped to reduce the heat load on buildings. You can see porches and awnings. Almost every old photograph has a main street filled with these iconic cloth awnings, which really help to control the heat in a building naturally, but they also helped with sun exposure and glare within the commercial buildings as well. Porches were important elements that helped shade the building occupants, but also reduce the heating load on buildings. Interior courtyards, we don't see these as much in the Midwest. They're a very common feature of architecture in the warmer climates further south, but these interior courtyards allowed for more access to natural light on the interior and provided greater passive ventilation through the window openings. And then they were often embellished with fountains that helped cool the space significantly and provided reduced heating loads on the adjacent building walls. Thermal mass, so a lot of really great stone buildings, brick buildings had incredibly thick walls, and their thermal mass, what happened is during the day, the buildings would store all the heat and the energy through the walls and then slowly release it during the evenings when it was cooler out. And then shutters, which anytime I see shutters, they're usually fixed to the exterior of a wall and provide just kind of a decorative feature to a building, but they originally were intended to be operable parts of a building that helped either block out sunlight during the day or protect it against storms. And one of my favorite features of old buildings that are almost impossible to find anymore are the transom windows. These were often or were installed in commercial buildings, especially kind of the narrow commercial spaces that helped allow light deeper into the commercial spaces, reducing the amount of lighting that was necessary. And then looking on the interior of a building, high ceilings and tall windows, they helped with airflow and improved natural light. Today, high ceilings make it easier to cool a space and encourage airflow when vents are added near the ceiling. This was a feature of interior transoms back in the day when we had operable interior transoms. They allowed ventilation through rooms within a building while being able to still close the doors. And then kind of the material side of things, old growth wood, a feature we really can't get anymore just because we don't have the trees like we used to. On the left, the historic wood windows is always a fight to try and make the case for preserving your wood windows, restoring them, not replacing them. I was at the National Trust Pass Forward conference 2 months ago now, and in a session, and someone made a really good point that everyone touts, vinyl windows are no maintenance. It's not like a wood window, so tear out the old windows and replace them. But he said, vinyl windows are no maintenance because you literally cannot maintain them. Once they fail, you have to rip them out and start all over again. Whereas a properly repaired wood window will last another 100 years. And then development patterns. Older buildings were built with walkability in mind. Districts predating, the 1920s when the automobile was widely available were built knowing that people had to walk or take a wagon to their destination. So they were built closer together. This type of city development allowed for access to transit, and the proximity of destinations makes it easier to walk and bike to your destination instead of always having to drive, and which leads to reducing traffic congestion, lowering fuel emissions, and reducing parking demand. Just a side-by-side here in Omaha, looking at the difference between West Omaha and some of the older districts east of 72nd Street. So on the left, we have 168th and Blondo, and on the right, we have Benson, which is our most recent historic district here in Omaha, just approved. But you can see that the more suburban development on the left has fewer homes. It's not as walkable. The commercial area on the north has essentially the same services with some fast food restaurants and retail locations, but it's not an area you're going to want to walk to or walk around in. You're going to, probably drive there. Whereas on the right, if you've been to Benson, it's a very walkable area. You could walk from one end to the other very easily. And visit a lot of different local restaurants and retail shops in the process. And then the way we used to design housing. Single-family homes were not commonplace until after World War II, when the American dream really took hold and government programs made it possible for more Americans to finance and purchase a home. So before that, many of the larger communities had more of these dense housing options, whether they be apartments, row homes, duplexes. And these types of housing are incredibly energy efficient because it limits the number of exterior surfaces that are exposed to the elements, which reduces the heating and cooling loads on a building, lowering the amount of energy needed to maintain them. If anyone's lived in an apartment on the upper floor in the winter, you've probably experienced this, where you don't necessarily need to turn your heat on as often because the apartments below you are running their air in order to heat yours up top. So looking into some of the green technology, so we talked about kind of the inherently sustainable features of historic buildings, and then there's all this new technology that can be applied to really enhance those features. So looking at green roofs, these are layers of vegetation that's planted over a waterproofing system on a flat or slightly sloped surface. There's different types, and it really depends on your building that you're working with, whether the roof was designed in order to be able to handle these extra loads. But there's a couple different kinds of green roofs. There's the extensive, which uses less soil, has limited amount of plants, versus an intensive roof, which has a lot more soil, sometimes can have trees involved in it, more dense plantings. Um, some examples of historic buildings that have added green roofs. There's a very small one on the West Des Moines Old City Hall. It's towards the back of the structure. City Hall in Minneapolis has a really interesting green roof on the interior of it, the bottom left image. And they even have bees on the roof. You can sometimes see them buzzing around. And then on the right, kind of a lesson on what not to do. So there's always ways to add green technology to historic buildings, but you want to do it in a sympathetic way. And so on the image on the right, you don't want plantings that are growing up tall above the roof parapet and decreasing the historic character of the building viewed from the street level. Looking at solar panels, solar arrays are a great way to provide a clean energy source to your historic building. Again, what not to do on the left with panels that are tilted and coming up above the roof line visible from the street. Corrected on the right by tilting the panels down and installing them in a way that they're not visible from the street. Geothermal is a way to heat and cool your building that uses an underground system. This one here is from Frank Lloyd Wright's Taliesin. They're actually doing some really interesting work. Their website is a really great source of information they've been working on for a couple of years now, where they're doing a bunch of retrofits to the building, trying to make it more sustainable, but really preserve the historic character of the building. And so on this site, they installed a whole underground geothermal system to heat and cool the building. And then looking at water conservation methods. So here, this is my backyard. I installed a rain garden and rain barrel in the back to help infiltrate water. Rain gardens are really great for storing water on site. And then rain barrels, you can store water and use them for other purposes. I used mine almost entirely to water the garden this summer. And then installing permeable pavers and then preserving the tree canopy. So permeable pavers are really great for infiltrating water on site. This image here is a campus in Western Technical Campus in La Crosse, Wisconsin. But you can also use kind of permeable pavers on small residential lots as well through driveways. Historically, a lot of our older homes didn't have concrete driveways, they were dirt driveways. So you're really not losing historic character by returning to a more natural way of providing a pavement. And then the tree canopies are really important because, especially a mature tree canopy, it provides shade to your buildings and can lower the heating load in the summer. So looking at a couple examples of historic buildings that have implemented new green technologies, but also maintained their historic character. They're both from Minneapolis. They do a lot of really good work up there. The Pillsbury A Mill, it's an awesome historic building right on the riverfront. It's a good representation of Minneapolis's flour milling heritage. And a couple of years ago, they renovated the building for affordable artist lofts. And in the process, they used the building historically used water power to run the flour mill, and they used those historic head race tunnels in order to install hydroelectric power that generates a lot of the electricity for the building. And I thought that the Mayor Fry's quote here is a really good way to kind of summarize basically what this presentation's about. He loved the project because it brings together historic preservation, conservation, clean energy, and the city's goal for growth. And then a residential version of bringing green technology and preservation together. This home is in the historic Whittier neighborhood of Minneapolis, and the homeowners purchased the home wanting to make it a net zero home. They did things such as installing geothermal wells. They have a solar array on the garage. You can see in the bottom right image. They installed LED lighting on the interior. They refurbished the windows, and then they use passive cooling through their their windows, have a heat pump, and then added expanded polystyrene insulation to the walls to help really reduce the heating and cooling loads on the building. And they came back through the program that this home used the International Living Future Institute. They came back a year later because they always want to certify that the building is functioning the way it was intended to. And they found that the building produces more energy than it actually consumes using the solar and the geothermal wells. So how do we incorporate preservation and sustainability? There's a number of different ways, and I'll touch on kind of how you can look at local ordinances, different partnerships, education programs, research that could be conducted, and then kind of long range planning. So beginning with local ordinances, we need new innovative building codes to integrate energy efficiency and historic preservation that's based more on performance instead of prescriptive requirements. LEED is a really great program for encouraging green technology. They have LEED for neighborhood development and historic preservation. So they're trying to bring preservation into the kind of green energy efficient building model, but they tend to be more on their program tends to be more on what you're going to do, not how it performs in the end. So trying to tweak our local ordinances to focus more on how the building's performing afterwards. Looking at how we tool our criteria for approval. We use significant events or periods of time, people or groups, architecture, patterns of development, works of master builders and designers, but we've never used sustainability as a criteria for approval. And precedents exist for expanding criteria for approval. Originally, preservation was founded on this idea of protecting our national heritage and history with the preservation of George Washington's home. And we didn't actually bring in the idea of codes that could allow beauty as a measure until the 1954 US Supreme Court decision in Bierman versus Parker. And then in 1966, when we created National Register, the criteria introduced the concept of associated value, which is events and people. So 50 years later, I would argue that we could expand the criteria again to include sustainability as an aspect of approval um, for inclusion in local or even national register. Ways to, if a building showcases a really innovative or really well-preserved example of an inherently sustainable feature, we're looking at those two other aspects of sustainability that I haven't touched on in this presentation, whether it contributes to quality of life or community building or knowledge transfer. Looking at our demolition ordinances, a snippet here of one demolition ordinance. It looks at what the significance of the property is, what the integrity of the property is, and even brings an economic value as a reason that a building could be demolished, but maybe bringing in a fourth criteria of the environmental value of the existing structure and including the inherently sustainable features and embodied energy, saying, no, we're not going to approve this building demolition because of its sustainable values. Another way to further the partnership between preservation and sustainability is to develop new partnerships. Often we kind of get siloed working in our own organizations, whether it be city offices, civic organizations, or just as designers and builders, but trying to find a way to make a kind of collaboration between all these different groups in order to share knowledge and to try and further how preservation can become a bigger part of the sustainability narrative. Education, I think our field does a really great job at educating. We're always putting together brown bag lunches, home tours, trying to bring preservation to just regular residents or public sector staff, elected officials. I think that we can expand those education efforts and do a better job of promoting preservation as a sustainable tool and a green building practice, and promoting saving places for more than just their history and their beauty, which are very important, but also layering on top of that how it can really impact sustainability and climate change. And then continuing to educate on maintenance and repair to avoid demolition. Often demolition by neglect happens, but making sure that we're providing resources and information on how to repair things like your historic wood windows. Conducting additional research, looking into how historic building energy performance can help decision makers choose the more sustainable approach versus what's easiest. Helps preserve both the environment and historic character of our communities, exploring opportunities and incentives that support energy efficient improvements and potential savings and benefits, and then finding ways to make it easier for a developer to do both preservation and green energy improvements. You know, they see the value in energy efficiency, so layering that in to make it easier so they're not going through multiple different approval processes. And then developing best practices and case studies for sustainable preservation. You can see here, it's the Washington State Historic Preservation Office. They've done a really good job of putting together a document on sustainable preservation. It has a bunch of information and case studies. And then finally looking at kind of our long range planning. Our comprehensive plans should really place priority on preserving existing buildings, whether they're designated or not, over demolition and new construction, because even if it's not, a great representation of some piece of history in our communities, it could be a really valuable existing building because of its embodied energy or other sustainable features. A lot of our plans, Lincoln's preservation or comprehensive plan has a preservation piece to it, and the California statewide historic preservation plan has a big sustainability aspect to it. And then kind of the current planning, we make decisions every day as local officials on new development projects, rehab projects, where things are going. So looking at maybe a hierarchy of redevelopment locations that we direct new development towards vacant lots first, parking lots next, underutilized sites, then we can start thinking about taking down those poorly constructed buildings, the buildings that are prefab 70s that don't have any historic character to them and probably aren't performing from an energy standpoint either. And then finally looking at your non-historic buildings that may be in those areas that are dense and walkable and near transit, that would be some okay sites to start to consider for redevelopment. So I'll end the presentation with a quote from the National Trust. 11 years ago, we started the conversation on preservation and sustainability. They said historic preservation must contribute to the transformation of communities and the establishment of a sustainable, equitable, and verdant world by reevaluating historic preservation practices and policies, making change where appropriate. This may mean less emphasis on strict authenticity and historical accuracy and integrity, and focusing on thinking creatively about the future of the built environment and its role in this larger system of sustainability. Needing to recognize that preservation is as much about people as it is about places and can impact the social and environmental and economic vitality in a community. Ultimately, the built environment is the habitat for humanity within the planet's finite ecosystem, and it's up to us to work together to preserve it. And with that, I will open it up for questions.
Hey, all. Thank you so much, Stephanie. We really appreciate you taking the time today to give this presentation. My name is Ryan Reed. I am a board member with the Preservation Association of Lincoln. And if y'all have any questions, feel free to go to chat, throw your questions in there, and I will read them off. And as a favor to me, don't use big words. That'll go a long way. But I'll just start off with a few questions right now, Stephanie. What are some ways homeowners can start to make their homes more sustainable without spending a lot of money?
Sure. So I think an easy place to start is outside of your home. You can look at installations like rain gardens or adding a rain barrel that can help infiltrate and manage water on site. general maintenance items like just repairing your wood windows, adding insulation to some exterior walls, replacing lights with LED, which have come a long way. I know LED was kind of bashed in its early years because it just had that stark white feel, but they've done a really good job of making some more warm colors that actually work better in historic buildings and homes. You could look into it gets to be a little more pricey depending on what you're wanting to do, but then looking into installing some solar arrays on your roofs, preferably your rear facing slopes, or maybe on a garage like in the example that I showed, but looking at local zoning regulations and permitting before getting into that. But those are some easy ways for a homeowner to make their building a little more energy efficient.
Okay. So how can you get buy-in for preservation as a sustainable tool when not everyone agrees on climate change?
I know that climate change can be a very kind of contentious topic, and not everyone agrees on it, whether the impacts and what we should do. But I think that from a preservation standpoint, you can if start with facts like what I used at the beginning of the presentation, but really using preservation as a sustainable tool without getting buy-in by promoting reasons like we're keeping debris out of the landfill, when we're kind of running out of some landfill space, conserving materials so the next generation has an opportunity to visit some of those places where we're depleting those material resources, kind of focusing on less of the climate aspect and more on the physical pieces of sustainability that people can grasp.
Okay. Well, we still have a little bit more time if people want to put some questions in. Okay, we have one question. In that net zero private residence example, were the homeowners able to sell their excess energy back to the utility company?
That's a good question. I don't have the answer to that. I don't think that the energy company in Minneapolis allows that. I know it depends on where you're at, whether the local utilities will do that. And I don't think it's very common, but I would have to check on that.
Well, if we have some more questions, feel free to put them in the chat. One thing I thought was interesting during your presentation, when you were looking at the elements of buildings and how a lot of those elements were created to deal with the environment that those houses or buildings were in. Because I have this really strong memory from childhood. In the house I grew up in southern Missouri, we didn't have air conditioning. And so my parents, with our double sash windows, they would lower the top sash and lift up the bottom sash to create a cycle of air. So the hot air would go out through the top and the cooler air would come in. And so it was interesting seeing your presentation talking about that. And it just brought all these memories back of, I didn't even know I was being, sustainable. My parents probably didn't either. Okay, we got another question. Can you point us towards resources on rehabbing windows?
I don't have any off the top of my head. Maybe, I don't know if Ryan, you have any. I think REO's website has some links to contractors that can do some really good rehab work. I know some other organizations that do like hands-on workshops on how to do window restoration, and we've covered it on at the Restore Nebraska conference as a session. I'll have to look at online resources and get that sent out.
Yeah, besides Restoration Exchange Omaha having those resources, you can also go to the State Historic Preservation Office website, History Nebraska. And if you go under the Preservation tab, there's a directory resource there for craftspeople across the state. So there's a handful of people in there for windows and, other things as well. And it looks like Nicole Malone put out the Craftsman blog there for everybody to check out.
Yeah, I've Good call, Nicole. That is a really great resource. They have some videos too on their website.
Well, any other questions? Give it a few more. This is great information. Will we be able to watch the webinar? Oh man, I'm getting all sorts of questions now. Let me go back. Will we be able to watch the webinar again and share it with others? Yeah, I believe, and Jeff, who is running everything here, who is another board member with PAL, this is being recorded, and I believe it will be uploaded to our website at some point.
Yes, as long as I get a good clean recording here, I will make sure I get it cleaned up and posted to our website very shortly after we get done here.
Great, thank you. Another question. I love the marriage of sustainability and preservation. It's interesting given the fact that we have a lot of tear downs here in Minneapolis, often arguing that new buildings are more sustainable, energy efficient, but your points about embodied emissions made me think more about this. Very good.
Yeah, we were talking right as this session was starting about how AIA, the American Institute of Architects, has this 2030 challenge where they're trying to get everyone to energy model the new builds that they're doing or substantial rehabs, and to really kind of raise awareness of how you design a building really impacts the sustainability and the energy used in that building lifelong. But we haven't yet gotten to the point of the embodied energy part of that. We're always focused on the performance side of it. And so looking at, how much energy and trying to start to model the embodied energy and then counting that against that green new building, because you just tore down, how much energy in that existing building. It's going to take you between 10 and 80 years to recoup all that energy, even if you have the greenest, most sustainable building that you put back in its place. And I think that goes back to that education and awareness piece of really getting the data and then getting the data out there to show that preservation is a really good an important piece of sustainability.
Another question from the chat. Do you see the administration being more or less sympathetic to this topic, the new administration?
I don't know that I have a good answer to that. I think the new administration seems to be more on the side of, concern for the environment and supporting maybe some of the green energy policies, but I don't know that I've really seen anything about preservation or their support of preservation.
Okay. Anybody else? Any questions? Throw it in the chat. Let's see. Thanks, Stephanie. It's from Dan Worth. I think the more good case studies of Nebraska local projects we can assemble that have good data matrix will help us with educating our neighbors about the benefits of building reuse, even for the second tier non-historic building stock. I agree.
Agreed.
Yeah, Eric says excellent presentation. If there's not any more questions, we'll kind of get to wrapping this up. But once again, I want to thank Stephanie for taking the time to do this today, kind of being our guinea pig with our first online webinar that we're doing at PAL. So thank you very much, and we appreciate it. Thanks to Jeff, Eileen, and Kelly for helping put this together and make it happen, especially Jeff with the massive heavy lift of putting this all together. And thank you to everybody who attended today. We really appreciate you being here. We'll be doing more of these in the future, so stay tuned. And I'd be remiss if I didn't do this. If you're not a member of the Preservation Association of Lincoln, please head over to our website, think about becoming a member, and help us continue to advocate for our mission. And if that's it, I think we'll head out. And there's the website right there that Kelly Bacon put in the chat.
All right, thanks everyone for attending.
Yeah, one more question, and this will be the last one. Is this good for a CEU?
Not to my knowledge. I don't think it's I know it hasn't been approved for CM credits, and I'm assuming it probably wasn't submitted for CEUs either.
Mhm. All right. Well, that's it. Thank you, everybody, for attending. And we'll see you at a later date.
Thank you.